Thanks so much, Kurt, and for the introduction. And first, I just thank the team, Christine, and she and her team helped us a lot on the economic analysis aspect of the emerging technologies and how to the impact of applying them to data sharing in e-commerce, as well as Vincent Acopella, and then he's well known in the customs broker community and helped us tremendously with the insight. And also, we are very fortunate to have the Vincent Aniziano as our project champion, and then really with the valuable guidance, and he's really a champion of technology and innovation, and then pushing at how the innovations can be applied to enhance the mission of CBP. So really, we are thankful for the team and then the help we received, and also a few students who contributed to the project. So in terms of the project overview, the problem the project the focuses on that we investigate and the potential of emerging technologies, and then how to apply them to address the e-commerce challenges that CBP and the global e-commerce the stakeholders are facing. So those emerging technologies such as distributed ledger and AI, or the standard used for data sharing, and then those are the emerging areas where they could be used to enhance the mission of CBP. So the specific objectives that include conduct research on the integration of support for customs process with e-commerce ecosystem, and look into the possibility to develop data cooperation, data sharing the models among the e-commerce stakeholders, and to achieve automation, the simplification of the e-commerce entry process, and to improve data quality and enhance the capability of CBP to do a risk-based assessment of cross-border e-commerce shipping and transactions, as well as look into the approaches and to harmonize the flow of information among the e-commerce platforms, intermediaries, and then the government agencies, CBP and PGAs, and specifically we also focus on the cross-border postal service for e-commerce, and see how the data flow could be improved that to achieve better efficiency, as well as improve the risk the management of the cross-border shipping of e-commerce. Also engage with stakeholders and evaluate the project deliverables and the outcome. So that's the overall objectives that we want to achieve in this project. And so the challenge of the e-commerce data sharing is that kind of well studied, that because for e-commerce the data actually held by the various intermediaries such as the marketplaces, platforms, and fulfillment service providers, and so those intermediaries, they have the data that for the e-commerce transactions, but very often it's a fragmented kind of scenario where the data actually, the e-commerce data fragmented in those the intermediaries platforms and their own databases, and that's actually make it a challenge to obtain a sufficient data that for e-commerce transactions, and also the most cases sellers that they don't have physical presence in the States. So this become make it the difficult to get data from the sellers, and also the sheer volume of the cross-border e-commerce parcels that arrive at the port of entry, that also make the e-commerce a great challenge to deal with. And then there is a recognized lack of transparency of the e-commerce marketplaces and the sellers. So those are well identified challenges, and then that's basically the problems, and then that motivate this project and then the research. The next the page. Thanks. And in terms of the research methodology, how we approach this problem, first I want to highlight that we follow the guidelines that we developed the early time of the project. That here the four major areas of guidelines we apply throughout the project period. So the first one, the CBP e-commerce strategy, that's based on the public, the released document information of the e-commerce strategy developed by CBP, the Office of Strategy. And we studied the CBP document, and then to see how that can be applied to as a guideline to this project, and as well as the COAC reports and then recommendations. So there were a few work groups of the COAC that related to this project. There's a e-commerce work group. There is the emerging technology work group. Also, there is a IPR work group. Just a few the more directly relevant to the project. So we actually studied the COAC meetings, the minutes, and recommendations and documents. So see how those connect to the project, and some of the valuable the comments and suggestions in those COAC the work group reports. Also, we try to incorporate them into the project. So the third area is WCO. WCO actually has a specific focus area of e-commerce, and I think in the last few years, WCO released a series of documents and guidelines that as an e-commerce framework. So that defines the e-commerce process, as well as right kind of standard that can be applied for customs to develop e-commerce kind of the strategy and then the procedures or process that be aligned with the WCO the framework. And so here at the bottom, I just list the WCO the 15 the global standard. So some of them more directly relate to the project, and some related, but not that directly. So just here, because they're kind of small font, I just mentioned some of them that we applied heavily in the as a guideline to this project. For instance, expand the concept of AEO to cross-border e-commerce. That's one of the 15 global standards by WCO, and simplified the clearance procedures, and another standard, and the use of international standards for advanced electronic data. That's related to data sharing and public-private partnership, and as well as developed technologies and the innovations that to in the e-commerce the area. So those the WCO kind of a standard that more directly relate to the this project. So in terms of the approaches, so here's kind of the activities or the approaches we use on the left side. So first we did a literature survey. That's basically cover things like the CBP e-commerce strategy, COAC reports, WCO, and as well as publications from like articles, journals. There actually is a World Customs Journal. They have articles as well talking about data sharing. And there are a wide range of reports and studies that we did a survey of them. And then what we actually did is to map the e-commerce data flow and the business process on top of the process and data flow developed by WCO. So the WCO the data flow for e-commerce and business process, that kind of a concept version, and we actually extended the model and with more stakeholders, as well as incorporate the data sharing the approaches, and we kind of developed as options for data sharing that so basically we enhanced the e-commerce the data flow, and then the business process model developed by WCO. In this process, we actually studied the e-commerce intermediaries platforms, their APIs. So typically, like the carriers, marketplaces, some of the fulfillment network, the service providers, they have electronic data. The interface and APIs, and as well as a document for developers. So basically, we collect them, we study the definition of the data, the elements define, and then how they actually the difference between different service providers, and then they have the same data elements, or some have some elements not included in some other service providers, and also look at the marketplaces, the carriers, and the fulfillment centers, so they see what's the difference, how the overlap, and then in terms of what data actually they collect, and then what data that their API, the interface actually require for the electronic data transfer. So we actually mapped the data of those service providers, and we also investigated approaches of e-commerce data sharing and different options, and then the impact of different options, the impact to the sellers, and then all the stakeholders in the e-commerce ecosystem, and then particularly look into the possibility to apply emerging technologies to enhance and augment data sharing. I think one concern often mentioned by the private sector, the stakeholders in e-commerce, is that expanded data sharing, the program may actually increase the cost of compliance or increase their burden to supply data to the government. So we look into the possibility that where the technology could help and to automate things to reduce the cost, and that's and also what's the benefit of applying those technologies, as well as the impact, particularly the economic side of the impact. And then that's the next one. We modeled the economic impact of adopting the emerging technologies, and then Christine and her team developed risk-based economic framework to analyze the impact of the emerging technologies. And then we engage with stakeholders with the help from Vince, and he helped us tremendously connect to the various the private sector, the trade, the community, the importers, exporters, and the custom brokers, and then to basically listen their comments and the feedback. So that's basically the overall picture that the approach we followed in this project. So next slide. Thanks. And in terms of the outcome of the project, so I just put two columns. The left side that's focused more on data sharing, and then the approaches that to address the data sharing. On the right side that cover the economic analysis. And Christine, if you don't mind, you could cover that, and I just go over the left side. So in terms of the findings, so one of the as also mentioned in the WCO framework, is to expand the AEO program to cover e-commerce. So a key concept is to have a tailored AEO program for e-commerce that specifically, for e-commerce data sharing, the AEO program be able to allow trusted intermediaries or online sellers to receive AEO status by demonstrating compliance and cooperating with other e-commerce stakeholders in data sharing. And specifically, actually, this cover, right, this holistic approach that be able to include all the e-commerce stakeholders, such as intermediaries, marketplaces, fulfillment centers, and then warehouse, right, the distribution centers. Some of them actually has a global network of the fulfillment centers that right as long as I think they have customers in the US, and they should be able to be included in the program to share data with CBP, as well as that to the share data with them with each other, that to enable this the e-commerce data transparency and then better visibility of the e-commerce transactions and data flow. The specifically that one often mentioned as challenge in the AEO program, or expanded the data sharing for e-commerce, is the small, medium size business, the challenges that they are facing. One concern is that the expanded data sharing for e-commerce may benefit larger companies because they have the manpower, the resources, the expertise to invest in the advanced technology for data sharing. But the small, medium-sized companies, maybe they feel like the disadvantaged position, and with in terms of the cost of compliance, or right, the competition cost. And then that's where the technology can help. The emerging technology, actually, exactly, we believe and identify that as the tools to be able to address that challenge, to level the playing field, because some of the technologies mentioned, distributed ledger or AI, they were open standard. They actually can be applied to improve automation. The things will be more automated, so reduce the labor cost, as mentioned here as well, and improve data quality. So overall, actually, they could right, make things more efficient and less expensive, and then more automated. So that means the data sharing, the actually will help. It's not like it will put them at the disadvantage position, and actually is on the opposite. If the applying those technology and together with right, the AEO program and the expanded e-commerce data sharing, actually they will get benefits of that, and it will help to level the playing field. So instead of right, what their concerns about. And then those the emerging technology can help to enrich the data sources, and then using the open standard can increase the data, the interoperability. And particularly, I want to mention that actually Europe has a project on the data operability for the e-commerce area, where they look at all the open standard and how the standard can interoperate with each other, how they can be applied together to have a stack of open standard that can be applied for automated data exchange, particularly in the area of global trade and the e-commerce. And so that kind of also relate to this effort, and to look into the scenario, the landscape of all the standards out there, and then what's the next step that be able to allow those standards, the data standard, work together, and to facilitate the automated the flow of data, and that from heterogeneous and distributed sources. So that's actually where the great challenge is, because the data actually may come from different systems, different stakeholders, and then they may use a certain set of standard, and another stakeholder have a different set of standard. And the key is how to kind of translate and map the data from one formatted using one standard to actually data formatted under another set of standard. And this actually can be done, and with some of the development in the semantic-based data standard that some of the international standard organizations actually are looking into this, how to define the semantic layer for the data that should be able to allow the data that actually described using one standard that be able to be mapped or translated automatically to data format using another standard. So with all the interoperable the data standards, and actually what the private sector they're doing right is try to build the so-called federated data environment that cover the data exchange among the e-commerce stakeholders, and be able to achieve better data exchange and the data sharing that has mutual the benefits to the stakeholders. So this actually we believe that CVP can leverage that those federated data environment created by the private sector, and be able to bind the customs data models with the data models of developed by the private sector for data sharing. So then in this case, the customer be able to piggyback to receive the data from those federated the data environment. So instead of all the data received and basically pushed by the private sector stakeholders to the customs CBP, and actually the customs can receive data automatically, and by piggybacking, basically kind of binding the custom data model with the data platforms that developed by the private sector, and this way that the cost to receive the data is lower. Also, we receive more data, have better visibility, and then the key idea is how to again, this is related to the WCO, the global standard, the private to public relationship. So how we work together to develop the federated environment where the government can be the supervising role and be able to receive the data automatically from such efforts that often led by the private sector stakeholders to build the data sharing platforms. So there are a lot of technology that behind to create such system. Distributed ledger is one of them. And there are other technology or hybrid approach, combine distributed ledger with, I say, cloud computing. And so when the really specific say you must use distributed ledger, but there actually there were services, for instance, most of the cloud computing service providers, they actually have a distributed ledger as a service, as one of the service they offer to the public. So that actually can be the leverage to create the data sharing platform. So there are actually different ways to create the platforms for data sharing, and then distributed ledger is one of them. And then there are different ways to build distributed ledger-based platforms. So I think, Christine, do you want to cover the risk-based economic analysis framework, if you don't mind?
Yes, thank you, Larry. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah.
For that. If we'll just jump in here quickly. I think I have a echo. Okay, it's gone. So what we did, Megan and I, we big picture. The objective here was to assess the costs and benefits for the key stakeholders, the sellers, the buyers, the marketplace, the intermediaries, and the government, and assess the costs and benefits that these entities would face moving to a distributed ledger environment, or leveraging the technology that a distributed ledger environment brings. So our goal was then to estimate the economic effects on all these different key outcomes. So we developed a risk-based model. So a detailed analytical approach, but a risk-based model where we really took advantage and exploited the incentives to share data and disincentives not to. So we examined the landed cost of one shipment in the current environment versus the landed cost of that same shipment in a distributed ledger environment, right? And then looked at the effects, the cost and benefits on those key stakeholders. And we break out that for the different levels of cooperation. When I say cooperation, we're agnostic on whether or not they're cooperating because they want to or not, or whether they can or not, right? So this reflects willingness and or ability to share sufficient data for speedy entry. And we break out different risks of a shipment. So for instance, you can think of like for low risk and high cooperation versus high risk and low cooperation. So low risk and high cooperation might be something that you're all familiar with, the trusted seller program, and then a high risk and low cooperation shipment might be, you know, an e-commerce shipment from a you know, a country that is prevalent in seizures, like for instance China. So we have a few key findings. We saw, and I'll just try to keep this brief, but one, so we saw that the number of shipments where the stakeholders cooperate increase, not surprising, and then the number of shipments where stakeholders are not sharing sufficient data for expedient entry will decrease. And then we actually have numbers behind that. And then we also find that the probability that CBP will obtain the data they need for speedy entry increases. And interestingly, and this is where Vincent may want to expound on, but we find that the technology costs are not significantly different in landed costs. So that is the technology costs are not significant for different landed costs. And I know if Vincent wants to jump in here, but he was as an economist, I didn't really, at first I didn't see the interest in that, but Vincent
Sure.
really can explain that.
Yeah, let me Christine, great work, and the data was excellent, and I just gave some perspective from a market perspective. So when we did when we were on the COAC, on the Customs and Operations Advisory Committee in the 13th term, we did a survey on dwell, and we found that most of the costs were associated with dwell time. And I know some folks don't always receive that message that, hey, the technology costs are not significant, but the real cost was in dwell and the amount of dwell of into market. And on the technology piece, many providers, like once this becomes standardized, many third parties will provide this technology within their existing, hopefully within their existing suite of services to filers that are already filing with CBP, Customs and Border Protection, or DHS. And that's pretty much, you could do a pay-as-you-go transactional type thing, as opposed to where folks were a couple of years ago, where you had to build your own interoperable system from scratch in your own company, which obviously is very expensive, right? But so we took the assumption that third parties would be programming this and reselling it, repackaging it to filers. And then just to reiterate, a lot of the cost was on the dwell side, and meaning that the faster it moves to market and the faster that it releases with good data and more data, that would be a measurable reduction in cost. So Christine, I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you for that. And then I'd like for Megan just to jump in and say a few words on the additional key findings.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, just finally, we found that moving to a digital distributed ledger environment led to an increase in the economic efficiency of the importing process. This is largely due to the fact that the cost that is incurred from the importing process is usually passed on to the buyer or the consumer, and the distributed ledger environment reduces the time cost of the importing process and also some monetary costs. And so in that way, the importing process actually improves, and therefore increases overall economic efficiency for U.S. consumers.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And that was, for trade economists, that's really important, right? Because the shorter dwell times means improved economic efficiency. Dwell time in our framework, you can really think of it as like it's the wedge between the price that the foreigner pays, well, the price of the U.S. importer is paying and the foreigner is receiving for that shipment. And so, the greater that wedge in between those two prices, the greater the dead weight loss, we would call it, or inefficiency. These are basically costs that this is basically money out of the buyers and sellers and consumers' pockets that kind of just evaporates, right? Nobody benefits from it. So as that dwell time shrinks, then you get those efficiency gains back, and that makes economists very happy. So we were really interested in getting to that, kind of looking at that more closely and measuring it, and that was I think one of the more interesting findings from an economist perspective. But of course, Vincent, I think, was really able to highlight some other key findings and interpret our key findings for perhaps the broker's perspective.